Good afternoon, good friends, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Dr. Michael Murphy here from Loyola, Chicago, a director of the Hank Center, and happy to present another installment of our Hank Center Presents, which is a Public Voices series. And really happy that we can welcome our good friend from Pepperdine University, Dr. Jason Blakely. Welcome, Jason.
Thank
and
you.
A word about Jason before we begin our conversation. Jason is widely published, widely engages media on culture and political science and kind of social and cultural issues. Has 4 books and is working on his 5th right now. Congratulations there, Jason.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But we're here to talk about his book that's coming, be available in March, probably in a couple weeks from when this is recorded. And that book is Lost in Ideology, interpreting modern political life, excuse me.
Correct.
Yeah, congratulations on the book, Jason.
Thank you.
And, our main hope today really is to do a little unpacking and talking more about your book. And so I thought maybe a good idea would be just to kind of jump in with reading the first paragraph from the introduction, which is really kind of gets us oriented in a way I quite like. So if you wouldn't mind, actually, it's funny, I said, Jason, do you want to read the paragraph? And he said, I don't know if writers like to read their own work. I'm like, I get what you mean. Some really do, and some, it depends. So we did Rochambeau, and I drew the cards. So I'm going to read Jason's writing, which is really quite beautiful. So this is how Jason begins his book, Lost in Ideology. What is ideology? The answer is simple if you don't think about it very hard. Ideology is politics in excess, distorted, immoderate, and delusional. It is pundits shouting at each other and unruly mobs chanting in the streets. It is an uncle ranting about socialism at holiday dinners, or a coworker lowering his voice to whisper about the dangers of the system. Facts are of no avail when dealing with the victims of ideology. Rational arguments slide off their brains like rain running down a granite dome. I mean, what an elegant and penetrating way to begin the book, Jason. Why did you choose to start it that way?
Because I think that, and by the way, you read it beautifully, much better than I could have read it, very expressively, thank you. But yeah, I would say that the reason I started that way is because there's a widespread notion, even just amongst ordinary people, that ideologies are inherently negative or bad, or that they're just synonymous with false political beliefs. And I think that's one part. I think there are many parts to our disorientation in an ideological age. But part of the problem is everyone suspects that ideology is someone else's problem, that they have true political beliefs or a theory, or that they just have common sense or good practical mindedness, and that it's really their neighbor or someone else who's the one who's really the victim of ideology. And I don't think that's quite right. I think we all have to reckon with ideology. I think we all have ideology, and it would be better to see that.
That's interesting, and it really is a thread that you articulate and sustain throughout the book, which is I think its strength, one of its many strengths. I thought right away as a Catholic reader, am I a victim of ideology? Do I believe in an ideology? I don't think I do, and I think I can delineate. But I think one might say that I am a victim of ideology. How do you think about that as a person who's religious?
Yeah, well, one way I think about it is that the world religions are in fact older than the age of ideologies. Wow. And I define in the book that the age of ideologies emerge in a time of secularity and theory building and mobilizing around political ideas. By contrast, the world religions extend, millennia backward: Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, etc. That having been said, religions can in some ways intensify ideological commitments and even become completely swallowed up by ideology, so that people don't even notice the difference between their political commitments and their ideological ones. And there's really no breathing space or light between the two. Now, I wouldn't say as a Catholic that you're victim to ideology. I just say that as modern people, and as the church, as a pilgrim church that wanders through all epochs and ages, we too wander through the age of ideologies, and people in the church are given some guidance from Catholic social teaching or aspects of Catholic theology in the tradition as to how to face an age of ideologies, but it's really not decided for us. The church doesn't come out and say, this is the one official ideology of the church. To the contrary, the church seems to accept a certain amount of pluralism amongst the laity to discern for themselves. So we're left maybe fortified by the Gospels, by the sacraments and so on, but without actually a formula or recipe for how to handle it. It's left to our freedom, and it's a problem for us.
That's interesting. I think a person I worked on, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who very much is into styles. So, but there's a pluralism there that's implicit. And there's a symphonic metaphor he uses. I think a bit also of that old line of this that people say Augustine said it. I'm not sure, but unity in essentials, diversity in non-essentials, charity in all things. I mean, the Catholics have been pretty good at that, right? Because they're transmodern, I guess. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're trans-ideological. Or, Catholics in the United States, you can even see it in this moment. I mean, the dispute happens as to is this person really Catholic and all that, but sacramentally and as part of the church, they're Catholics across the ideological spectrum in the United States today. So if you think of everyone from, Justice Scalia, who recently died, but is often associated as a major figure in conservatism in the United States, right? All the way to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Joe Biden himself, the sitting president, right? So the breadth of Catholic experience, in fact, most of the Supreme Court, it's commonly said at the moment, is Catholic, right? Both the liberal and conservative sides of the Supreme Court at the moment. So Catholicism is very involved. It's having sort of a moment in the United States ideologically. And the dispute becomes very intense because, Catholicism enters into really how should you align? But the church itself doesn't necessarily referee that very hard, those lines very hard. It gives some guidance, but doesn't actually give, some kind of prescription to adherents as to what to follow ideologically.
Yeah. Reminds me of the political commentator E.J. Dionne, who has this view that there is no Catholic vote, but it matters.
Yes, that's a wonderful
because
quote.
people,
Yes.
they line up, 50-50, or, you can look at the last. This reminds me of an article you wrote, I think in 2016, that was it political science was a casualty of the 2016 election? Because, all the political scientists I know, they were kind of wrong.
Yes.
But then you see, it probably is a symptom of where ideology comes in against maybe the limits of science or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, I think, so in ideological age is one in which we have to sort of reckon with our older traditions that go way back millennia, world religions, different ethical sources coming from the ancient world, but also with how they how ideology interfaces with newer sources of authority. Science is a big one, right? And and a lot of my book is really about this sort of fraught and I think difficult, complex relationship between scientific authority and ideological authority. Because one of the main claims in the book is that the way people become lost in ideology is they try to sort of grab scientific authority and say, my ideology is simply scientific. And I actually think all the major ideological traditions can do this. Everything from, obviously people think of things like scientific Marxism, which thinks of it as just a hard-nosed science, but I also think a certain form of libertarianism that says it just has a free market, science for organizing society, to progressive liberalism has a certain scientific note to it. So a lot of my book is about people get lost in ideology in part when they think their ideology isn't really what I call a political map or story, but is instead somehow just a science or just data or just a description of nature.
Well, let's come back to the map and the story, because that's a good figure or figures you use to kind of thread through the book. But I am reminded in the reference to scientism, really, really well received and tour de force expert article called "Doctor's Orders: COVID-19 and the New Science Wars" that was in Harper's in August of 2023, and that really kind of took scientism to the shed.
Yeah.
But you're really demonstrating your kind of nimbleness, and I don't know, post-ideology, I'm not sure, but kind of navigating these kind of competing opposites and these tensions. And you use the kind of the COVID-19 and scientism thread for that. You want to say a bit more about that?
Sure, yeah, that article did kind of cause more of a ruckus than I expected, to be honest with you, when I wrote it. But the article was basically about the way in which I saw during the pandemic and the shutdowns that scientific authority was sort of going beyond its proper limits. And I was trying to sort of balance a few things, because on the one hand, scientific authority was itself getting sort of trashed around things like, can scientists really tell us about the vaccines, or can they tell us about the nature of the virus? My position is absolutely they can. In fact, we have no better authority than doctors and scientists when it comes to understanding COVID-19. My beef, and this is what kind of caused the kerfuffle, was that I think that scientific authority was often overextended into public policy and into an ideological domain to say what was supposedly the rational or only possible policy. So for instance, during the shutdowns, it was often said if you had certain data that triggered a policy response, like a certain amount of viral spread or pressure on the hospitals, that simply meant that you had to shut down, say, churches or schools or other arena parts of the economy. And so I thought that no deliberation was had, no contestation openly, as we should have in a democratic society, around whether or not we ought to shut it down or what's worth suffering sickness or viral spread for. And so this is kind of a case example. In this case, I was picking quite hard, I think, on a certain form of technocratic progressive liberalism, which can have its positive aspects as an ideology. But I think a lot of the governance around the pandemic sort of said, well, there's certain markers, certain scientific triggers, and when those are hit, we don't have deliberation. We simply have a shutdown of, say, churches. You can't have like a funeral in person. And I thought that that was taking out of ordinary people's hands. Maybe we did need to shut them down, by the way, sometimes, maybe not. But what I thought it was taking out of ordinary people's hands is the actual honest ideological debate about things like what it's worth being sick for, what it's worth risking death for, what it's worth risking even filling the hospitals for. And instead of having that discussion, that difficult discussion, I saw sort of a top-down attempt to treat ideology as what it's not, which is a science or just data or just numbers, when in fact certain interpretive questions were being short-circuited.
Well, you were fulfilling a role there as a philosopher, and I'm with you because there was there's health and safety, and we're into a pandemical place. So obviously, we are looking to science to help us, but there were uneven applications, and they were absolutizing in ways that if you just basically you could see where the fissure was between healthy science and ideology if you're really looking closely. Even people that are not, say, progressive, or people who actually are progressive. Say someone maybe who's a classic scholar like Giorgio Agamben, who was spotting. He's got some conservative commitments, obviously, but he spotted something saying we're into a new territory here, right? And I think you were following on that really sober kind of analysis of it, right? And that's the best of us because that really retains what philosophy can do, and it's also appreciating what science can do, and when philosophy is charlatanism, and when science is scientism. So that's the dialogue.
It is.
Are people hearing this, you know?
If I can say that, because one thing I think on the other side is we have a crisis of scientific authority, right? And so you had people in sort of Covid-19 wards saying, I'm dying of pneumonia or colds or something like that. And so they weren't listening. It was kind of a performative contradiction. Here they were going to the hospital because, of course, where else would you go if you were extremely sick? Really very sad, very tragic, and yet we had these reports of people who had become so skeptical of scientists and scientific authority in society that they've entrusted themselves to nurses and doctors, and yet they're not listening to the diagnosis they were given. And so part of what I thought was, I was trying to balance there, which is kind of a difficult position, is I actually think some of the blowback against rightful scientific authority comes from precisely its overextension. And that's something I would say to my progressive friends is, the overextension or the overuse of science in one arena is actually sort of driving, because then what you get is ordinary people have a hunch that, okay, there was some kind of ideological sleight of hand was pulled on me when I was told I couldn't go to, say, a funeral mass, or I couldn't put my kids in school, and it looked like these, maybe people who had more money and had private schools, they could already put their kids in school, but there were public closures, at least in California, where I'm from. And so it looked like an ideological sleight of hand. They didn't know what to do with that. And so then they doubled down on sort of anti-scientific sentiment more generally. So I actually think it's this vicious cycle that cuts across kind of ideological positions.
Yes, most astute. And so I think you really do sustain that in your book. So let's kind of go back, because you take a figure of, you go deep dive into ideology, as a phenomenon or as a genealogy of thinking. And then you come up with these two images, ideologies as stories, ideologies as maps. Maybe, we just had maybe an example of ideology as story, but maybe, is there another example of the place where ideology is a story we tell ourselves, or it exists narratively?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that, because I think absolutely something key, and one of the reasons we're lost in ideology, this major metaphor in the book, is because people mistake ideologies as simply data or science or even common sense or nature, when in reality, ideologies are cultural. They're a product of our sort of interpretive capacities. They're a product of our ability to make meanings. And so I instead try to use this replacement metaphor for ideologies as maps. It's a very famous metaphor in the literature. It comes from an American anthropologist by the name of Clifford Geertz. And he says, ideologies are maps, right, that help orient us within political space. Now, the reason I think this is so important, and it might seem like, okay, well, yeah, of course, an ideology is a map, and you asked for some examples. So to give some examples of this, for instance, if you're a progressive, your map tells you something like, politics is mostly about the orientation toward rational progress, a rational, emancipatory, universal project of people being able to self-fulfill without this sort of baggage of tradition potentially, or maybe tradition can stay, but it should be a private choice within liberal rights. So that might be a map you have that helps guide you, right? That the common space societally is kind of the use of reason toward progress, right? If you're conservative, a story you might have is tradition is beleaguered, it's under attack in a modern age, it's falling apart, and faddish new moral theories are taking its place, and so you need to mobilize around tradition in the defense of customs and morality, and that might be your guiding map or story. And so part of what I'm trying to say in the book is, look, ideologies aren't bad per se. Everyone has a map, and the map is an effort to orient yourself within political space. So if you think about a map, I mean, a map is a positive thing. Without a map, you don't know where to take a step. And I really do think modern people need ideology. In fact, the very attempt to do without ideology is just a naive living with ideology, right? Because when you try to get rid of ideology, all that happens is you end up assuming it in the steps you take in your actions without knowing it, right? You end up following the crowd in a certain direction, or you end up conforming to certain institutions or the people around you. So the very world we live in is shaped by ideology, so I sort of see it as non-optional. But the key thing is to see that they are maps. And if I can say one more thing here, I'm a huge admirer of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine short story writer. And so one of the major metaphors of the entire book is from his short story called On the Abuse of Science. And in this story, he basically says, look, the problem with this one little empire, this is completely fictional, but there was this little empire, and what this little empire did is it tried to build a map the very size of the empire. Point by point, it was the very size of the empire. And after several generations, they realized this is like a completely bogus thing to do. Why are we doing this? And they dropped it. This is how I think of ideologies, is that our ideologies are maps that we try to make the very same size as the world. And the way we get lost in them is when we think of cartography or cultural map-making feature as just mere nature, just out there. And so in some sense, already brutally given. Like conservatism is just brutally given as opposed to a cultural tradition. Liberalism is just brutally given as opposed to a cultural tradition. So that's my main metaphor for the whole book, is that people become lost in ideologies, and we become a lot better at debating them and at even listening to other people's ideologies if we saw, look, an ideology is a map, it helps orient you, it helps guide you.
That's really beautiful and helpful. You think of kind of our lives of story we're living, if you think theologically, we're on a pilgrim journey where we've come from somewhere, we're going somewhere. Except if you get mystical, you could even think of someone like Antonio Machado, and what's the line from his poem, Caminante no hay camino, right? So there's, you want to go a place where there's no map. But if we take our interlocutors that you have, like someone like Alistair McIntyre, someone like Charles Taylor, they're going to say there's a map here. We came from somewhere, that's say pre-modern, and something happened in the modern kind of historical moment that really did ramp up the kind of, I think, what we're calling ideology in its negative sense, or the sense that we mostly receive it. That we've been through something where there's agents and subjects and objects and power structures and then political preferences and all kinds of liberalisms and pluralisms, that we find ourselves in this story where the plot is thickened.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's right.
Yeah,
and I draw very heavily on the work of Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre. And I think part of the drama of living in an ideological age is, okay, we realize that one of the ways we can go badly wrong is through ideology, right? And that's one of the ways we can become very disoriented. And if I can add one other feature here from the book about in ideologies that I think we need to see is ideologies, if they're maps, because I try to improve on Gertz's metaphor, if they're maps that make the world. So unlike the maps we use to guide us with, say, Google Maps or in a mountain range, when it comes to ideologies, the very map makes the social world, right? So one of the reasons we get sort of lost in sort of silos, or it seems like our ideology is just simply true in some way beyond being culturally true or true as a narrative or a story that we need to interpret and debate with other people, is that everything in our social world reflects back at us our ideology, right? So I think that one of the reasons we're very skeptical of ideologies, we see, oh wow, they can be all englobing. And I think modern people rightly feel a little bit of cross pressure or discomfort with that idea that ideology can swallow you up. And I think that's a true intuition. At the same time, we really don't have any other way to guide us within politics and ideological age other than ideology. You know, and so I think the positive features of ideology also need to be brought to bear. And one thing I really try hard to do in the book, because in some ways the book is sort of a tour of all the major ideologies. It starts out with this kind of theory of ideology. It describes ideology in general, but then each chapter goes into a different ideological map to try to get people to understand how it works on its own terms, right? So we look at liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, ecologism, feminism, socialism, all ideologies. And what I try to do in each chapter is show the reader, hey, this is what's ethically attractive and orientating about this ideology. This is why people are pulled into it, or this is what they find attractive. I use this term ethically magnetic. And you could think, for those listeners who are familiar with Charles Taylor, that's basically me borrowing from Charles Taylor the notion of strong evaluation or moral sources, but seeing, okay, modern people have as one moral source, and in fact in a very powerful, even dangerous, violent one, ideology.
Gosh, that really, it's refreshing in its intellectual kind of acuity. You know, like when you hear something that's true, you're like, it really makes you stop and say, yeah, I hope it gets a wide readership because, you know, the lessons are astute. I kept thinking about meat, you know, so culture barks back at you, or, you know, you almost perform it. I'm like, okay, if I drive to work and you know, what's the culture I live in? And then the ideology that props it up. I just think right away of, it used to be just a billboard saying something to me. I learned about culture, what's being advertised and what's being called. Now I'm into kind of a social media ecologies, and the kind of the, you know, what ideology is being trafficked and conveyed in those media. How does ideology morph or evolve or expand or mutate? Or does it when it's into kind of a cyber social sphere?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. 'Cause in a way, the way I see the cyber or internet or technology is it's accelerated or dramatized a process that's true from the beginning of modernity with ideology, which is ideologies are what I call liquid. So again, this is me trying to improve on Goethe's map. Goethe was a genius, so I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant here, but I'm trying to tweak it. And part of what's wrong with the metaphor of maps is maps are static, right? So if we think of ideologies as maps of culture and of meaning, we might think, well, they're always the same, but they're not. And the age of the internet has shown us that. And like other cultural artifacts, like other artifacts of meaning making, ideologies can change really, really fast. And my term for this is liquid. I think we're living in an age of tremendous liquidity, or not even age, like the last decade, I think ideologies have become extremely liquid, extremely fast in the United States. Some of this has to do with the collapse of the Cold War polarization that happened in the United States, and certain ideologies are in play again that seem to have gone away. And some ideologies have come back in new ways. You think of like things like millennial socialism, or the debate around fascism and ethno-nationalism on the right in the United States today. Is it back? Is it not back? Part of what's going on here is ideologies, like any other cultural thing or object, are liquid, so they can fuse, they can hybridize. You know, so you think of like fusion music or fusion food. You know, you can hybridize Mexican food with Polish food. You can hybridize, you know, rap music with, you know, heavy metal or something like this. But when people tell you, no, you can hybridize ideologies the same way, they seem to be stuck in a bad concept of ideology where they think, no, ideology can't do that. A liberal can't mix with a conservative. And there might be philosophical reasons why we think that's not a good mixture, but they can mix. So you can have new iterations of all the ideologies. And I think one of the reasons people's heads are spinning so much right now, it's like in Shakespeare's Richard III, he says it's a reeling world. It's a reeling world, Catesby, right? And you know, the empire won't sit aright, or the kingdom won't sit aright until the crown is on Richard's head again. It's a reeling world. I feel like we live in a reeling time. And part of the reelingness of it is we're lost in ideology and we don't realize how fast things are changing, how fast they reel. And there's a lot of ideological creativity on the internet, but there's also a lot of ideological capture where you end up in a silo and this world-making feature loops back on you. So it looks like your ideology is just common sense, and you lose the ability to speak another ideological language to someone outside your silo.
That does make sense. That's really, again, very astute, very helpful. It makes me think of, I think of Richard III, you know, in the winter of our discontent here all of a sudden.
We are, yes.
But, you know, I think about ideology, say, in culture wars, which has its own pathology, its own genealogy, but it's talking about this liquidity. Is there liquidity coming from, say, the 1980s is a certain kind of culture wars that were kind of prominent that we noticed, say, in the West, in the US. In 2024, they're a bit different. I mean, there's resonance. Have they liquefied and hybridized, or how do you think about that? Does that bear on your theory at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, so I grew up in the 1980s, and we were talking before the interview, so we have similar common points of before the Cold War. Yeah. Before the Cold War, the world seemed very static. There were some scary things about it, there were some positive things about it, but there was an entire opposite pole ideologically globally embodied by the Soviet Union and its world-making power, to use my ideological terminology, right? You could travel to the Eastern Bloc, sometimes it was difficult, but you would see an entire different ideological landscape where the map had made a different kind of a world. And it really seemed like it was never going to go away, and it surprised Sovietologists.
In 1990, we would just, what happened? Well, Fukuyama? I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
And suddenly you got pieces of the Berlin Wall. Solid things melted, right? Now, I think that for millennials and younger, so for my students' generation, they're used to, but also reeling with the rest of us in a very different ideological climate where everything is up for grabs. The ideological experience for millennials and younger is really quite different, right? Because in a way, everything is up for grabs now. So it's not only up for grabs in that parts of the right or the far right are, again, sort of part of the ideological landscape of the United States, or at least off of the periphery. Forms of ethno-nationalism, even sometimes forms of white supremacy, openly white supremacist politics, or fascism. But also on the left, you have the revival of democratic socialism, various parts of the Marxist left on the United States, which really were on the fringes, right? Because there was sort of a left-right liberal consensus during the Cold War that felt like it wasn't going to go away for a very long time, even to the point where people like Francis Fukuyama would say it's the end of ideology, and the only thing to work out from now on is what variety of liberalism we live with. Right? And it is a very strange liquid age, because not only do we have the return of ideologies that some people thought weren't going to come back, but they've come back in new ways in these fusionisms and hybridizations that, they can be scary, they can be inspiring, they can be a breath of fresh air. But one thing that is just amazing about them is how plastic and fast they are at changing. And I think even those of us who still remember before the Cold War, it's an important thing to sort of begin to orient again, which is part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, because I really think all of us are quite lost, reeling.
Wow. Again, another compelling insight, attractive, and inspires one to read the book. So that's, and I just read the introduction, so I'm looking forward to this, to reading the whole thing. I did notice in the introduction something I hadn't seen before, which is you're talking to your reader and you're saying, well, while I would really love it if you read the whole book, feel free to what? Feel free to plop around, you say. Why? That's amazing.
Well, in part because I feel like the book is a map of the maps. Uh-huh. And so I want to sort of respect the fact that I gave the maps a certain sequence, right? So it's a map of the maps, right? It's a map of all our ideologies. It's an attempt to sort of give the terrain of all the ideologies. But I also realize that some people might want to explore this mountain range and this valley, this desert, to extend the metaphor for a moment. And that there's really no reason to start with the sequence I start with per se, right? Also part of that is sort of, I've become a little impious with books. Books have completely changed my life. I'm a bibliophile. I adore books. I know you do too, Michael. But I think when I was younger, I thought every book had to be read almost with this kind of piety of the first page to the last, a sort of superstitious piety, whereas I realized, a book is to be helpful for a reader. And maybe this is next level reading and you want to start out with the awe before a book, but sometimes an author has different things to say to you in different places. Yeah. And I wanted to respect that not every reader approaches a book the same way.
That's really nice. That's great. I think that's really kind of refreshing, but I'll tell you one thing. I read much differently today. The way I read is so much different than when I was a kid, and I've been through those pious years too, but I'm not exactly happy with my new reading habits either. I feel like I think I'm becoming kind of fragmented somehow. Yes. I don't know if you have a word on that.
Well, I do, because in a way you told me something interesting before the interview, which is, in a way this does reflect the age of the internet that we're all in too, right? Yeah. That you can almost zoom in to different parts of the book, and that I just went ahead and said up front in the book, much like you would on the internet, select a part of the newspaper, the article, whereas before the artifact would have come, you would have gotten ink on your hands, you would have to turn pages to find what the journalist didn't think you should read first. Now people really get sort of lost in the mazes and labyrinths and byways and things, and in a way the book maybe does have something very contemporary about it in that sense. I would still rather people read the whole book, of course.
You heard it. You heard Jason there, people. What's the future of ideology? What are we going to make? You know, I don't know. Even a map like in your philosopher's stone or crystal ball, like the year 2050 and ideology. The end of ideology? Probably not. What do you see?
I think, and this is something I take from both Taylor and McIntyre, but I think the person who could already see past an ideological age would already be taking us into that next epoch, and I really can't see what it would be. I can't see, every time someone says they've taken a step behind ideology, like Fukuyama or Marx saying, you know, there's going to be a revolution, and finally we're going to have a communist society that's beyond ideology, or conservatives saying if we just recover tradition, we're not doing ideology anymore. I think that every time someone does that, they just naively reproduce ideology. And that's one of the things I want to get rid of in the book is that, you know, the book is trying to not just be descriptive, but also critical. And part of what it's trying to say is a true theory of ideology can own itself as cultural. That doesn't mean relativistic. It means we have to do the difficult work of interpretation, right? An art of interpretation on our stories to see which one most resonates, which one has, you know, internal problems or not. But I don't think we have any easy way out that I can see right now. We're kind of doomed blessed to live in an age of ideologies, if you could say it that way, because ideologies have these negative features and also these kind of positive features. I am trying to find a space for dialogue. I think of that space as humanistic, right? As a space in which everyone who can recognize that we're meaning makers who are making the maps inside of history can have a kind of dialogue and an imaginative ability to try to see what another person's ideological world is like. But I don't, and I also think, like I said, that the world religions, for instance, I think Catholicism gives us a way to take one step out at the same time that we realize we're creatures of this age, and so we also have one step always in.
Yeah, I just think right away of someone like Pope Francis, you know, who's really steeped, but he's not the only one. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, these are encounter people, right? They're dialogical people. This faith is dialogical, right? So that is something that can always ground what the kind of the wild abandon of an ideological, you know, with this jettison from something that's humane, centered, maybe transcendent, to think about Taylor again. That might be a little bit different.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's possible to have horizons and sources of meaning that transcend the ideological.
Yeah. Okay. You know, really wonderful. Thanks so much. Here's a couple personal, quick lightning round questions for you. All right, Desert Island. You get a book, and then you get all the music by one artist. You get one book though. Maybe 2 books.
2 books?
Yeah, 2 books, and then all the music by one artist, and then one food. So,
okay, all the music by one artist is easy for me. Bob Dylan, who I know you like also, because I think Bob Dylan is a literary genius.
Yeah,
working in a pop form. So
that's a good choice, and there's a lot of music there.
There is astonishing amount.
Astonishing amount.
Yeah, you could spend your whole life dwelling in different eras and songs and things of Dylan.
Yeah.
In terms of food, gosh, I don't know. I'm hearing my doctor say, "Why don't you have something on the island that actually helps sustain you, like, but bread and apples or something."
Yeah.
But if you ask me, something I like,
you like,
like maybe jambalaya or I don't know, avocado toast. I'm from California.
Very good.
And then books. I hear my inner Catholic voice saying, if you don't say the Bible, you're definitely not making it anywhere. But I admit it's not the first book. I'm used to having the Bible read to me by priests, so I'm not used to actually reading it myself. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, I would pick, and then also maybe a book of poems, either T.S. Eliot's collected works or Czesław Miłosz, who I know you met and like, because I think poems actually get you through life, whereas I don't think that, or maybe the Brothers Karamazov, I can't pick. Look what you're doing to me. I'm going to drown in the water with the books.
Well, the thing about the Taylor book is that, like, by the time you finish it, you'll probably be rescued, and you can also keep your tent down. It's so heavy.
Yes. Or could we use it for a life raft in some way? Not to be too impious, because Taylor's a hero of mine, but for kindling, there'd be all sorts of uses. There's a lot of paper there.
Yeah, but man, what a singular genius.
Oh, he's a genius.
Yeah. Well, Jason, we look forward to tomorrow. We're going to have Jason is doing our St. John Henry Newman lecture, where Jason will not be talking about his book as much as he'll be talking about his conversion story. And he's calling it Atheist, the Story of Conversion. But for right now, this is just a printout of Jason's, the cover of his book, Lost in Ideology, Interpreting Modern Political Life. Much needed. And thanks again for being with us, Dr. Jason Blakely. It's been a real pleasure.
It's an honor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.